I've been really looking forward to today's conversation, another installment in this season of the Black Fathers podcast series, a collection of video conversations covering a spectrum of intricately connected topics related to Black fatherhood. I am Dr. Alvin Thomas, clinical psychologist and assistant professor in the School of Human Ecology at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Teamwork makes the dream work. The family that prays together stays together. There is no I in team. Blood is thicker than water. Whether the parents are living together or not, the importance to the developing child is undeniable. The quality of the co-parenting dynamic is essential to how their values and goals are transmitted and supported for the growing child. Maternal gatekeeping, where mothers restrict access and interaction between the father and the child, and undermining, where the father reports feeling that their parenting practices may be met with displeasure or at worst, rejection, are all key elements of co-parenting. However, fathers' confidence in their parenting abilities or their risky behaviors may also challenge the co-parenting relationship. How do fathers deal with these co-parenting challenges? Joining me in discussing this episode's topic, co-parenting as teamwork, are Associate Professor in the Department of Psychology and Neuroscience at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, Director of the STAR Lab, Dr. Shauna Cooper, Associate Professor and the Deputy Dean of Curriculum at the University of Chicago, Crown Family School of Social Work, Policy and Practice, and a faculty affiliate at the Center for the Study of Race, Politics, and Culture of the University of Chicago, and principal investigator for the Chicago Parenting Initiative Evaluation Study, Dr. Waldo Johnson. Rounding out our panel of experts is a public health leader, family advocate, and poet, like myself, Mr. Dwayne Curry. Thank you so much, all of you, for joining us. I'd like you each to take a little bit of time, maybe take about a minute or so, to tell us a little bit about the work that you do and its specific relevance to Black fathers. Maybe we start with Dr. Cooper first.
Well, I will keep it brief, but a lot of the work that I do is really what is the context in which we can support fathers as they support their children? And so the topic today around co-parenting is really that, right? So how do parents work together? How do we do our own individual work as we move together to work to co-parent? And so my work is largely focused on those factors, but also how race-related factors, discrimination, other employment, all of those factors impact how parents parent, and in this case, how fathers parent.
Excellent. Thank you so much.
So it's a pleasure to join you, Dr. Thomas and Dr. Cooper, and the opportunity to also be in conversation with me today, Mr. Curry, today regarding this conversation. Like Professor Cooper, I'm a father scholar that studies the role of fathers in families. And I'm particularly interested in this particular topic because as many of us recognize, many African-American families are often families where the fathers do not reside in the household with the children, which often leads many, including some scholars, to kind of determine that these fathers are not necessarily involved. But I've been working to examine the ways in which father involvement occurs even among non-resident fathers. And also for us to begin to hope this opportunity leads for yet another opportunity for us to begin to kind of think about how it is that co-parenting opportunities structured in the context of non-resident fatherhood is another way to demonstrate the strengths and the resilience of African-American families, despite many of the structural and sometimes individual challenges that might prevent them from engaging fully as a family unit.
Thank you so much for that.
Hi, everyone. I'm Dwayne Curry. Thank you again for having me. I manage and create grants at the Waldo Johnson Foundation, all of which aims to support families to raise thriving children beginning at their earliest years. I also host a podcast called the Life and Blended Podcast with my wife, where we aim to create a space of just an open space so that we can have a diverse set of perspectives on things that people deal with every day, such as family, relationships, co-parenting, step-parenting. I'm also an occasional poet, which most of my work focuses on being a Black man and being a Black father, and how even something as simple as walking out your front door and going to a store can have a completely different impact based off of the color of your skin. And I share my work that just focuses on those different perspectives. So thank you again. I'm glad to join you all today.
Excellent. Maybe we'll have to ask you to share one of your poems with us, but we'll be more than happy to also highlight your website or your podcast so fathers can find some of those additional spaces for them to engage some of those conversations. So off to the panel. So we know that individuals are coming in to parenting with their different experiences, and of course are bringing different mindsets and worldviews to their parenting. And so because of those differences, we can expect that parents are probably going to differ in their approach to child rearing, which of course is going to lead to a different kind of parent-child relationship. How should parents negotiate those types of differences? And how should they negotiate the disagreements more broadly?
So I'll jump in first. So one thing I didn't mention, so I have a blended family. My wife and I, we have 4 young children, all under the age of 9. And so the topic of negotiating disagreements and how do you navigate through that is something that is just critical for my everyday life. One thing specific to child rearing and also disciplining children that I found to be important is that it needs to clearly be defined before you get into specific situations. So if a parent is taking on, or a step parent is taking on an authoritative role, it shouldn't be decided while you're in a situation, because then you may overstep certain boundaries. So there are different ways to navigate through that. I've heard of many different approaches to parenting and co-parenting. And some of them are helpful, I believe, for different points of a relationship. One approach that I heard of is called a nacho approach, where basically the parent or the co-parent is somewhat in a backseat role, where they're treating the stepkid as they would, let's say, a child's friend, say their friend. They allow the biological parent to parent their own kid as they seem fit, and so they're not that in that authoritative role, which has its pros and cons. May be helpful when you're first starting to blend a family, as opposed to later on. But then so this is why I mentioned it's so important to make sure that it's clearly defined, because you wouldn't want to get into a situation where you act out in a certain way and you may cross lines, and and children are smart regardless of how old they are. They can notice that. So that's something I think is really key.
I like that concept of essentially learning the lay of the land, the relational lay of the land, learning where the landmines are. And by landmines, I mean those areas that people are not ready to deal with and don't want you to step on. Those elements of child rearing that they hold very dear and very personal to them. Learning where those things are, those boundaries are, and you may come close to it, but you won't touch it. But of course, like you said, if you're just jumping in and trying to learn that while you're dealing with the situation, you're more likely to step on landmines that you didn't know were there.
Absolutely.
So I can definitely see the value in the perspective that Dwayne just provided for us. I mean, there is clearly some benefit to having some sense of the lay of the land. coming in. And the assumption that we often make with parents that when they have children, there have been some discussion whether they're biological children or they are forming a blended family. Mm-hmm. We might predict, or we might assume, that might be a better way of saying it, that there have been some discussions about the way in which parenting will occur in those settings. And so I would say that that may very well be the case, but I would think that there are probably lots of instances where parents are learning as they go, in terms of how they negotiate parenting when they're parenting together. When many of us think of co-parenting, we're also thinking about parenting in a context where the couple is not together, right. Physically together, or as a result of separation or divorce. But it could also be other kinds of situations that result in some period where one parent is away. It might be military service. Right. We might also think about it in the context of incarceration, which is a really important way to think about it with respect to perhaps African-American families, given the preponderance of African-American parents who are incarcerated. Mm-hmm. And so when I think about those contexts, but I also maybe add to that parents that perhaps were never formally together, and when I say formally together, not necessarily by marriage, but perhaps there was no period of time when they actually were a couple in advance of it. There may be lots of things that they are learning about themselves and the couple experience as they are parenting. And so that does pose a particular kind of challenge, for us in terms of thinking, what then becomes the ground rules? How is it that, we navigate? I mean, I very much appreciated Mr. Curry's point about with respect to co-parenting, say in blended families, where the non-biological parent might not readily engage initially, and that might be something that occurs over time with respect to leadership around certain activities in parenting, maybe discipline, maybe an example. But I think that there are some parenting situations where people come in totally cold on almost every dimension of it. Right. And I think some consideration for how we then begin to help to prepare those parents for the challenges that normal parenting present, but when it is in a situation where you're trying to co-parent, and there are clearly some things that you're not on the same page with. Those are some of the kinds of things that come to mind for me with respect to a particular kind of challenge with co-parenting.
So I will just, continue the thought from the previous comments is really around so disagreements happen. And, I think that we, have to, I think we are in this space, but really normalize that disagreements happen with respect to parents. People bring different things, characteristics to the table, and sometimes they align, sometimes they do not. And in the moment of talking about parenting, that's where you see, what you think we should discipline our child in this way, or no, this is how my parents raised me. All of those things often come up. And so I think, part of it is really normalizing that disagreements happen, but then what is our approach for talking about, how we will come to a consensus, right? It doesn't mean that, everyone's approach will, we'll move to this side of the spectrum with the decision, or the other side, but what is sort of this middle ground, if we can call it that we can use that as we make decisions about parenting. And that sometimes that is an easier thing to happen. Other times it can be more contentious, and there may be several tries needed to come to what that parenting consensus might be. But I do think that part of it is that just the normalization that parents don't always agree, right? You may come from a very strict household and think that this is the ideal way of disciplining. You may have been raised or have beliefs about this is how you communicate or discipline your child, and that is okay. But what is the next step for how we will parent jointly? So again, I believe that supports are necessary. So again, it's not always easy to get there, but places where you can talk out that process and really sort of, or even just couples, whether or not they were currently attached or previously attached, right? Is that they're still a couple in the sense that they're parenting together, but how do we communicate our broader views around parenting in a way that will allow us to be more effective at it or in that role?
So I think just from the broader discussion that we're having, I hear that we can agree. I think you talked about finding that middle ground, Shauna. We can find that common ground that all people believe that a child needs to have parents that are working together. I think we can agree on that. We agree that there's benefit to the child from having parents who are in agreement. And I think that's our common ground. My question is it always feasible to have parents in agreement? Not that people can't have disagreements or won't have conflict, but is it always feasible to have and effective to have parents in agreement, to have parents co-parenting?
I think that it's desirable.
Yeah.
But I like to go back to Professor Cooper's contention that it should be an expectation that there are going to be times when parents will disagree. It's probably not as serious when the disagreements are around what we might view as minor concern. But I think when it comes to, things that we consider are major things, and, whether to the points that were made about whether it's whether you're more comfortable as a parent with a more of a strict approach to parenting versus more permissive parenting or something in the middle. I think those kinds of things can have a wide range of activities that might occur under those potential three areas that may be of reasons of concern if there's broad disagreement, at various stages, with children. We might be talking about even in along the lines of discipline, whether we're talking about during childhood or how discipline occurs in pre-adolescence and in adolescence. I think they can matter. And so I'm not certain that we can necessarily expect that parents will agree on every single thing. But I think that in order for a co-parenting, and particularly a co-parenting relationship to work, and when I say work, not only with respect to having mutual respect for each parent, but work for the child, because I'm trying to imagine what it's like to be parented by a parent that is totally permissive and another parent that is totally very restrictive about things, and the kinds of confusion, that might send in terms of messages to the child.
So you mentioned the idea, and I think it came from Shauna's comment about setting those realistic expectations that parents can disagree, that it's natural, it's normal for individuals to disagree. Sometimes we disagree with ourselves. That's normal. And I think that fits really nicely into two different conversations we've had before. One about communication and how to have some of that communication and engender some of that positive communication. And the other about the intersecting identities for Black male and father, how those influence and kind of shape our communication skills, but also how that shapes our co-parenting skills. I think setting those expectations for kids that adults can disagree, kids can disagree, but what that disagreement looks like, I think is probably more important. That we can disagree and do that civilly. We can disagree on particular issues and not hate each other or not want to harm each other. How do we do that?
Oh, that's a hard question.
That is a hard question.
I mean, as you said it, I thought, well, wait. I mean, almost every person could benefit from that training, just in the general, scope of the world. And so I think, I think that it's work, so part of it is parenting is one of the hardest things for anybody to do, because you have to also deal with your own experiences, how you made sense of how you were parented, how you make sense of your role as a parent, and also do that in conjunction, not just with your co-parent, but if you have other family members and other perspectives and so I do think it means that it is a more involved and engaged process. I think that when I hear about how when parents are often talking about the things that they're disagreeing about, so I do a lot of work on how parents talk about race, for example, and sometimes there's differences in that. And so some of these, I think, Waldo's comment about, minor disagreements versus sort of these bigger ticket topics, are where we see where people, need additional skills to work through, because there's several layers. And so, talking about race or discrimination, one parent might be okay just being as honest about those experiences. And you might have another parent who might feel like, no, we should not talk about these issues in this way. And then they may have, sort of have to work through it. And, the only, what I often say is for when parents are often saying that to me is really just to pull the layers of what's happening around. And often it's wrapped up in their own experiences and how they remember that topic themselves as a younger person, but as a younger person who has matured. And so some of it is both the group work, but also how you were thinking about that topic and its meaning to you. And so that is it's just a more, I think we underestimate the time that we need as individuals to have personal reflection time. And, I think, we can think about it both for men, Black men, but also I think we all can really benefit from really thinking about how the world has shaped how we act, or how we think the world thinks that we should act as a parent. And so sometimes that's good we can think about, I don't want to use the word baggage because it has a negative connotation, but that's a good thing about what we bring. But sometimes it can hamper our communication. So, I always say is that's a hard answer, and there is no easy answer to give other than to just be in a space where you can feel free to really sort of think about and pull back the layers of whatever topic that might be the nature of the disagreement.
I completely agree with that. I just want to build on what both of you said, where the more clear the agreements are for the bigger issues, the less likely you are to get into disagreements about smaller issues that's going to have a big impact. And what I mean by that is that if it's issues, and I'm speaking specifically about co-parents who are not in the same household, there may be critical issues regarding the child's health, or what to happen when XYZ situation happens, or a variety of other things that are really important to the child. But then there are things that fall into this box that it may be a disagreement, but it may be more annoying or frustrating than anything. And what I mean by that is it gets to parenting styles. And especially when you're in a different household than the other co-parent, it's very difficult because you may have very different dynamics in each household. One term that comes to mind is a Disney parent, where one child may go to one parent's house and they get anything that they want, eating candy all the time, going to sleep at 10 o'clock, 11 o'clock at night. But then when they go to the other parent's house, there's actually structure, there's rules. So it's different cases where no, that's not necessarily a huge deal breaker or a major disagreement. It has to do with a parenting style, but it does impact just the nature of how you can co-parent together, especially if there's two completely different environments in the households.
So I want to pull on your experiences with your kids, especially from the context of the blended family, and kind of some of what you've hinted in your own experiences, Dwayne, and then I'll let Shauna and Waldo jump in as they wish. So again, speaking about this whole issue of conflict between parents and how that plays out for them, how that plays out for the family system, but also how that plays out for the child. So in an attempt to kind of protect their children, I know that parents, we should withhold certain kind of information from our children, and we should protect them from certain kinds of experiences that might risk the exposure to sometimes potentially problematic experiences. So sometimes it can be more harmful for co-parents to attempt to resolve their conflict with the child present, or at least with the child witnessing. Should parents hide parental conflict from their children? Is it okay to have your kid witness an all-out brawl between yourself and your partner? Or like, how much do you allow your child to see, and where do you set those boundaries?
So that's tough. I think it's layers to it. Mm-hmm. I'm not going to say every disagreement you have, go upstairs or go to another place in your house and talk it out there. There's clearly going to be situations where parents within the household and even co-parents may not be able to handle, or at least be able to hide from their children. Mm-hmm. I think what is important is the level of those disagreements and what type of disagreements that there are. For me personally, what helped the most was having a legal document that outlined all of the big picture agreement and areas, such as the times that I'm going to have my child. And in my situation, my ex-wife, my son's mother, and I have a 50-50 split with my son. So the document outlined the time that we have them, the holidays that we have them, how much money we're both contributing to his joint account. So a lot of those big situations were taken care of. Wow. And whenever we would get into disagreements of things that involved him, what we tried to do is we tried our best to not have those conversations in front of him, and even to say, okay, let's table this and let's share it at a later time. There's some things naturally that you may not be able to do, but then there's also situations where even if you share them at that time or later time, you may not be able to handle them. So and I can share later, but that's when things such as a mediator or other folks may be extremely critical in helping to bridge that gap, to limit the amount of arguments or confrontations that both co-parents may have.
So you mentioned a mediator. So again, still staying in that realm of how you determine how, and I assume that even the child's age, the child's level of maturity would also determine how much you allow them to witness, how much parental conflict you might allow them to witness. But I heard you mention seeking out a mediator for more contentious issues, getting legal agreements if you have some of those situations. Where else can parents get support for mediation, preferably without putting themselves or their partner at risk?
So I'll jump in quickly. For me, and being a Black man, it's terrifying thinking about. I know when I was going through this, and this was several years ago, going through these type of things that I had to consider and deal with was very intimidating to me. Even walking into a courthouse or walking into a police station, terrifying. And so I say that just saying the difficulty and how uncomfortable it may be to navigate through these situations, especially if as a Black man, you may feel as though your rights, you may not know what your rights are, but you may feel like somebody can easily take them from you. It's very difficult to navigate through. There are a lot of resources that are available that are free. Many lawyers or attorneys that you may reach out to, just reaching out to them, they have, and I'm not thinking of any in particular, but often they may have a open session that you can have with them that, and what I've seen, maybe 60 minutes, where you can share your concerns, share different things, and then it's just free legal advice for that amount of time. And then they can advise you on the steps that you may need to move forward. That's personally what I did. And then I actually drafted an agreement myself, and me and my son's mother worked through it. So we actually were able to do that on our own. Also, I would say there are some therapists that may serve as mediators. So and that's something that happened with us. We had a therapist that we were working with, referencing me and my son's mother, who was also a mediator. So he put on a different hat when we had to deal with very critical situations, especially some of the bigger situations, where it was somebody that wasn't biased and can actually stand in the middle and bridge many conversations that we had. Because there were so many cases where, especially earlier on, where we couldn't even have a simple conversation. There was pain, there was hurt, there was all these other emotions running free, and it may impair someone's decision, even though you may have the best intentions. So having that mediator helps to ground folks, and especially, again, I'm just thinking from my place as being a Black man, how scary it is to navigate through some of those things. You may feel like you may feel like you do not have any support. There's a lot of support. We just have to find it.
Waldo, I know your Chicago Parenting Initiative evaluation study does provide support for young fathers. Do you deal with any of those kinds of issues in that program?
Well, as you said, these are young parents. In many instances, the mothers were adolescent mothers, and a number of the fathers were adolescents also chronologically, although in many of those families, the fathers are maybe 3 to 5 years older than the mother. So some of them may be legally adults, but on a spectrum, they are still late adolescents. So, but it was also a mixed bag, because the project included both African American and Latinx families, and whereas in African American families, the parents, the maternal grandparents and the paternal grandparents often do not encourage the young couple to form a family together and to live separately. Some of that is due to economic situations, and if those young parents are trying to access federal benefits like TANF, they're required, the young mother is required to live with her mother if she's an adolescent. In contrast, in some Latinx families, the young couple may live with the young father's parents. And so that's a different kind of structure that brings to bear a different set of supports and kind of depthness of supports that may be available to a young couple. It also poses some challenges for the young couple in terms of their ability to kind of make decisions, you know, and stuff. And so as I listened to Mr. Curry's explanation for how he might manage that, I'd say largely the couples that were in this project would not have the kinds of resources that are probably available to Mr. Curry. You know, they're liking in age and experience in some ways. And also, one of the things that we spent a lot of time working with the young fathers, because the project included moms and dads, but it was largely focused on the dads, is helping the young fathers to kind of suddenly recognize that as parents, while they still may be young and wanting to do a lot of things that other adolescents and really young adults may be doing, they had some obligation to kind of give up some of those things to be in support of their children. I know in a lot of programs that are focused on teen moms, that's one of the things that they have to do. And I think the same thing occurs with dad. So even as I listened to that explanation, a lot of the maturity that Mr. Curry talked about, he exercised, and his son's mother exercised. We didn't always see that with these couples. Some of that is just where they are in the developmental stage. You know, some of that is also about some of the potential economic insecurity, you know, that they also experience. You know, some of it is about the kind of duality about parents infantilizing them in some ways, but at the same time wanting them to be responsible adults.
Right.
And so it's not a fair kind of comparison. I won't say that the youth in my study are representative of all young people, but I probably see more of that than I've seen in other situations.
I mean, you know, just to, you know, tag on what has been said, I think so just beautifully in terms of the layers of what we are in terms of thinking about like resources, and the resources, not just like resources that you can access, like instrumental resources, but just, you know, how we grow over time and the resources that we develop. And even, you know, I use my own, you know, self, how I dealt with conflict as a 18-year-old, 16-year-old is vastly different than someone who is, you know, many years older than that. And so that, you know, I think when we think about that within the context of parenting, I think that that's, you know, partly underlying, right? And so we have, you know, groups where, you know, individuals who, you know, may not know the appropriate sort of mechanisms, resources that they have available at their fingertips. And frankly, I think that, you know, when I see parents who are not even just younger parents, but parents who are frustrated about their feeling, their feeling that they have lack of control to, you know, make decisions or to do these things in ways that can help them, right? So we see parents, often fathers, who are frustrated about accessing resources in the system, or that, you know, people, they're feeling that people and systems aren't helping them in their desire to, you know, parent. And so I think that both of it is sort of the resource question in terms of like these, you know, more tangible resources, but also just how we think about conflict, right? And so, you know, there might be conflicts that happen where kids are in the room. There might be conflicts where, you know, parents may say, well, why don't you go to your room? And there are various ways in which that happens. But I do think that in the moment, we are less likely to see how to think about the various ways, right? And so some of this is just how can we, you know, people who are service providers, who work with parents, who have parents in our lives, really think about how to communicate that. Because I think in the moment, it's hard to rely on those things because you just, you know, it's conflict, you forget things, you think about it later, oh, I should have said that, or, oh, I should have done this. And so some of this is, you know, less about the conflict, the nature of it, but what are the ways in which we can provide opportunities for parents to develop these skills so that when they are in situations of conflict, that they know how to access resources, whether they are resources about how to use and access their systems appropriately versus how to, work through some of that with your co-parenting or partner. So
yeah. I'd add one thing in reflection, thinking about the comments by both Professor Cooper and Mr. Curry. I also want to add that there's also this way in which parenting shifts over time as people mature, maybe have more children or have more experience, with your children. The first time, I really recognized it was coming years ago when I was coming home to my parents' house during a break in graduate school or something, and my young niece and nephew were there visiting with my parents, and I noticed all of the freedom that my parents allowed them to have that was never accorded to me and my sister when we were growing up. How they could sit in any chair they wanted to sit, and even with their shoes in the chair and things of that sort. And I recall asking my mother, what's going on here? Something to that, akin to that. You never allowed us to do that as children. And my mother quickly responded, these are my grandchildren. And so these were not subsequent children that she had, but she saw her grandchildren differently. They're going to be here for a period of time, and then they're going to go. And so while they're here, they can this can be a refuge from mom and dad. In my research experience, I've observed fathers who think differently about their younger children than they thought about older children, particularly in instances where they were non-resident fathers and they had limited opportunity to be involved with their kids. And so there may be ways in which some instances they may not be as stern with younger kids, but in some instances, depending on what went on with the older kid, they may be far more restricted than they were with others. As I think about something I've learned from this, I'm quick to say that the father you are at 16 is not the father you'll be at 26 or 36. And so there are lots of different things that are probably going on that might be influencing parents. And as I think about some of the violence that have been inflicted upon children by law enforcement and by gangs and communities, and the pandemic that we're still experiencing in some way, even though we think that it's all but gone, I'm sure will shift a lot of parents in the way in which they think about parenting and the kinds of things that they will consider normative for the children to do. And suddenly some things that may be off the table that prior to this moment was not or were not.
I think the saying is that you never step into the same river twice. I think it's a similar thing for parenting, that you never step into parenting the same way that you did when you first stepped into it. You might be a better parent, you might be a worse parent, but you're going to be a different parent, and you're going to be somewhere on that spectrum. Even the idea of worse versus better, I think it's just a matter of a spectrum of where you fall on that. So thinking about, again, how non-resident fathers and in some cases resident fathers deal with conflict with the mother of their child. I've been hearing a lot of stories when I talk, especially with non-resident fathers, who talk about their stories of dealing with maternal gatekeeping. And sometimes that's maternal gatekeeping coming from the mom, or very often, especially for younger fathers, it's maternal gatekeeping that's coming from grandma. That's the maternal grandmother. And talking about, again, the negative relationships or romantic experiences that they've had between the mother and the father, and how that often spills over into their attempts to parent their child. So how can a broken partnership be repaired? And when I say broken partnership, I think people might automatically think families that don't reside in the same space. You can have a broken partnership, parenting partnership that is, even if you're married and living in the same home. Can a broken partnership, parenting partnership be repaired? And where do you start?
I mean, I'll go ahead. And so I think of it as active versus inactive partnerships, because those partnerships are always there, whether you're accessing them or not. And so, they may be more active than inactive, but that, I think part of it is really, as you were, talking, and as we're talking about the previous sort of context around conflict, it really made me, and I think we're all sort of saying this, is that when people are stressed out, when people have all of these other concerns, all of these factors that we're talking about, it makes it harder to go in these spaces and bring the resources that one has, because they're so overwhelmed by things going on in their environment. And so when we, are talking about partnerships, it's just, it's both the parents, that involve the child, but it is also that broader community context that I think is really helpful around supporting how parents parent, parents, caregivers, whomever those individuals are, right? And so I think some of it is both reparative, but some of it is also proactive, right? In terms of how we support people who are caregiving, who are parents in their roles, so that when there are times of high stress, right? And we can think about that historically for Black folks, Black men, Black women, in terms of how those networks have supported us through, moments of high stress, whether it's economic stress, employment stress. And so, I think that, for me, I think about it as, so these questions are no easy answers. So that's the theme of all the questions that you have given us today, Alvin. And they're no easy answers, because they involve several systems and our adaptation to those things over time, and what that might mean for us on a family or sort of parenting level. But when we think about partnerships, it's both, how do we support it, right? So how do we support it, its inception, and then how do we support its continuation? And like, those are two very different ways of thinking about how we can support parenting partnerships. But I also think, we can think about it beyond those two individuals, to think about who those players are. The gatekeeping, a lot of our fathers have talked about their struggles with gatekeeping, for example, and how that they, even if those issues are over in the current context, they also reflect on those moments of gatekeeping as being pivotal for how they view their efficacy as a father, and often a man, right? So a lot of that language is, I felt that as a man, they prevented me from doing this, or as a father, they prevented me from doing that. And that those moments of feeling that you don't have the same ability and control over parenting as others around you is really, at least for our fathers in our work, they've been very candid about how hurtful that has been to them, right? And that they've had to seek out other supports to move past it, right? But not everyone has the supports to do so. So that's sort of my broader theme around the partnership question, is that, sometimes we need to, think about those other resources that help us deal with the hurt that might come from some of those interactions.
Excellent. Thank you so much for that.
So I'll add specifically on, and I completely agree with everything Dr. Cooper just said. So I want to add specifically on what the father may be able to do as an individual. I think there are two key parts that may be helpful, especially when you have this relationship, this like a contentious relationship that you may want to mend. From what I've seen, it helps to make sure that you're reframing the focus and the perspective to be on the child. Often what happens is that depending on what happened in a relationship, especially if a couple was married or together or living together and then they moved on and into their separate lives, is there may be a lot of emotions that may still be involved in their dynamics, or at least as an individual. And when you focus specifically on the child, it helps to detach some of that from it. And what helps to do that is by setting clear boundaries. It's helpful just for the father, and also I'm sure for the other parent as well, where I'm speaking personally, boundaries such as no text messaging after 10 o'clock at night. I'm just being very real, and making sure that there's clear boundaries so you're protecting yourself, and also that you could focus specifically on a child, because then you may get situations of, oh, you didn't answer my text, but you can go out and you can do all this and this and that based off of looking on their social media or other stuff. So having those clear boundaries is very helpful, because then it allows both parents to realize that regardless of what this relationship was beforehand, what it is now is a co-partnership, it's co-parenting, it's parenting together. And it's very important in whatever way possible to separate what was and what is. And often when it still merges together, and when it may come in conflict, it makes it much more difficult to mend any relationship if you're not focused on the existing relationship and the most important relationship, and that has to do with the child.
Yeah. Yeah. So today's theme definitely is that there are no easy answers to co-parenting. There's just so much that goes into it. And I think, if anything, the message to Black men, to Black fathers, is to be kind to yourself. Do the best that you can do, work hard at it, because it takes work. Find support, find support outside of yourself, outside of the family if necessary. Build your resources, find resources to help you and to help your partner and to help your family. But this takes work. You don't get it the very first time. You have to fail a few times. You have to keep trying at it. But at the end of the day, it is worth it. So as we close this very enlightening conversation, maybe each of you could share a couple of messages with fathers who are listening, or maybe bits of practical advice that they could go home and commit to working on. And we can start with Mr. Curry and swing back over to Dr. Johnson and end with Dr. Cooper.
Sure. So I'll start off. If I had two things to share, one would be to recognize that parents, they are watching their children grow up, but children are also watching their parents grow in many cases, as we alluded to in this conversation. And often we forget that that's happening. You may have this young person watch a parent, again, as Dr. Thomas said, a parent at 16 or 17, actually, I think it was Dr. Johnson as well, but a parent at 16 or 17 or 18 may be much different than a parent at 26 or 28. So I think it's important and to realize that and not be too hard on yourself, but just remind yourself that there's a child watching you grow as a father as well. The second thing that I would say specific to blending families is that often people think of it as a blender where you throw all these parts in it, and you have the children, the parent, the co-parent, the new person, and then it just blends. But often that's not what needs to happen. And I heard someone say this one time, where it's often it's like a crock pot, or you may have some of those carrots that take a little more time to soften, and that's what you may need. So it's all a process. There is no easy answers, but there's also not necessarily any one way to do things as well.
Thank you. You just made me think that maybe I should take my crock pot out today and think of cook something in it. But thank you very much for that.
I'm going to follow Mr. Curry's lead and keep my points to just two. I would say that in advice to fathers, that parenting, even when you're co-residing, and we think about it in the kind of traditional sense of two parents, with children, poses a number of challenges. And so when you are co-parenting and parenting apart, we should anticipate that in some ways those challenges become magnified. And so recognizing that parenting, as people often say, comes with no instructions and all of the things that we have to kind of figure out. when you experience some difficulty, it's important not to personalize it too much, but to try to figure out, where is it that you need to begin. And I think in instances where parents themselves have not had, as we started this conversation, have not had time to kind of talk about their parenting styles or their parenting expectations, that will potentially be a landmine at some point, because it's likely that you may not be in total sync, with one another. So the degree to which you can develop comfort in talking about those things before you have to react to those things in real time can be very beneficial. No, I'd say that that other thing is that fathers, need to feel comfortable also in not in acknowledging instances where they may feel some uncertainty and some insecurity, and maybe they are able to get assistance, from their co-parenting partner, from family members, or if, as Mr. Curry talked about earlier, if kind of professional help might be inclined, that can be very beneficial to the extent that parents, whether they're fathers or mothers, can focus on the needs of the children. That can ideally result in positive parenting experiences between the parents as well as for the child or children.
Excellent. Thank you very much for that, Dr. Johnson.
So, I think, I'll just, if I continue on with what the beautiful thoughts that have already been said in terms of the summative thoughts around, co-parenting is hard, right? It's really hard. Parenting is hard. And I think that, some of this is just, taking a breath and realizing that it is going to be difficult, and there'll be moments of sort of peaks, and then there are going to be some valleys in this process, and that for what I often tell parents and what I tell fathers is really around finding your supports, or thinking about what are the spaces that help to nurture yourself as a parent. And so our fathers will often say is that my co-parent or my wife or my girlfriend, people are always asking her about parenting, and that fewer spaces ask men or me about parenting, beyond, hey, how are the kids? And so we, some of our work that we've done, we've asked fathers, what are the spaces that they're accessing? And it turns out, and I think we've all seen it, social media has become a very big space for men to reach out and find supports, even when they don't have it in their close proximity, right? And so part of what we have learned from that is that the need to find the space that helps to nurture your parenting side in a way that will allow you to go into these discussions with your co-parent, and can be potentially helpful. So that is one of my sort of main takeaways, is to figure out, what your supports are, what supports you need, right? Or to think about them, and then think about ways to seek them out or to access them in your daily life. Sometimes that's easier said than done, but I think that it may not be, your minister who is going to provide that support, or someone down the street. It could be, one of these various, there are actually quite a few social media groups that are focused on Black fatherhood, Black fathering identity, that are hugely popular, but I think they're hugely popular for all the reasons that we've talked about today, right? And they're being accessed and they're being utilized, and people find comfort in those spaces, right? So I would say is that always give yourself grace as a parent, is that it's hard. There will be missteps, there will be successes, but I think for us is, as we think about the work that we all do, it's also a challenge for us to think about how we develop supports for fathers, Black men in particular. And so I think some of this is thinking about how parents think about their roles as parents, but it also is a challenge to our broader societal context, and the ways in which we think about ways to support Black men and fathers in their their role in their roles as parents and or co-parents more broadly.
Oh, just very beautifully said. Again, I think in the spirit of being kind to yourself and taking this in baby steps, I think Dr. Cooper gave an excellent suggestion of using some of these social media spaces. I think a lot of fathers might be sitting back thinking, you know what, I'm not just going to just show up in the community and be like, hey, dude, what are you doing with your kids? Let's talk about our kids. But if you can find a space where you can be anonymous and just follow something on Instagram or wherever, where you can listen to people talking about their fathering experiences, watch their pictures, listen to their stories, watch their posts and their tweets and all that stuff, that starts to create a space in your mind and in your heart where you start to want some of that kind of interaction in more intimate, more close settings. And that may lead you to now starting to go into the community and finding some of those spaces. And in some cases, creating the space yourself if it doesn't exist. But I think that the first step is to just go on, find something on social media. They're just so, I can think of so many of them, and maybe we put some of them up in the podcast, where you could go online and just follow them. And they're just some really great pictures and little snippets of videos of fathers interacting with their kids, with their sons, with their daughters, talking about their challenges, their experiences, some giveaways, all kinds of stuff. And you can start posting your own stuff on their websites or on their social media platforms. So starting with something as simple as that would be, I think, a great step. So again, thank you so much for sharing your time and your experience and your expertise with the Black Fatherhood podcast series. There is so much practical wisdom and guidance that you have shared with us today. And I am convinced, I have no doubt, that you have helped expand our understanding and the conversation around the heavy lifting that Black men are doing and continue to do in their families and with their children. Non-resident does not equal uninvolved. That's one of my rallying cries, which I kind of picked up from one of my advisors. I think Waldo knows her very well. And that's what I usually see when I talk about Black fathers. We want to continue to contribute to building this wave of centering Black men as people first, as human beings with their own stories, experiences, and emotional lives, and then thinking about how the many social roles that they play as man, as father, affect them and those whom they love. We want to educate Black men, validate them in and out of their roles as fathers, and elevate them and the great work that they continue to do in supporting and loving on their children and families. Thank you so much for joining us today for another episode of the Black Fatherhood podcast series. Thank you for listening to the Black Fatherhood podcast with Dr. Alvin Thomas. If you enjoyed this episode, please share it with your friends on social media or post a review online. Thanks again for being part of the conversation.